go in a flyout. You did VF4 with the pilot every day. We flew a second airplane called the T-38, really tandem white trainer. And that was our instrument trainer. That was what we went cross country with, and that's what we really had fun with.
Somebody else was listening to the reaction.
Were there dual controls so that if need be, the intelligence gathering officer could fly the plane?
The guy in the back was called the spy. One airplane had two sticks. It was the trainer. All the rest, the back seat did not have a stick. The guy could control it back there and fly the airplane if he had to, but he couldn't land it or descend it. So two ejection seats.
Bill, I saw the way. It looked
Was
descents are a problem in the country.
the twin tails were the size they were because of a single engine handling characteristics. What was more common than an engine failure? And it didn't, I can remember one or two over a 10-year period. What was more common was what we called an aerodynamic disturbance, an AD, and it was really like a compressor stall. And when that would typically happen because of an out-of-sync condition where the inlet was recessed all the way back, you're doing Mach 3, and all of a sudden something gets out of rig, or there's a temperature change in the air that it couldn't handle very well, it would kick the shock wave out. And it was like a compressor stall, and you went sideways. And early on, when that happens, the nose wants to come up. And they lost a couple of them in the early years because when the nose comes up at that speed, it comes apart. So the bold-faced emergency procedure was, if you had an unstart, this aerodynamic disturbance, first and foremost, don't worry about the engine, it'll be fine. Keep the nose down, keep it alpha within limits.
I have a friend that built a radio control model of the SR-71, probably about 12 feet long or so, with turbines on it. And in a turn, one of the first things they learned was, instead of holding the stick back in a turn, you push forward on it. Is it pretty much the same flight?
Yes, exactly. The whole thing was a lifting glide that shined all the way to the nose. It wasn't really conspicuous as you make it sound. Below 1.3 Mach, you can handle like a heavy fighter. It was a higher speed. It was pretty delicate.
And Bill, were the controls in the airplane fairly conventional, you know, stick and throttle, or was there something peculiar about it?
No, it was conventional. What was not conventional was elevons in the back. There are no flaps on the airplane. No ailerons or elevons. But there was a mixing apparatus in the tail that was way ahead of its time, I believe, also.
Could you roll the airplane?
Not me.
So was there a V&E on the thing?
The speed limit on the airplane was compressor inlet temperature. That was what limited how fast we would go.
How high?
Again, temperature, very much temperature dependent. 85, 86 hours was routine.
But if you really wanted to go, could you get past 100 and...
You could, but you couldn't stay there.
What was your high limit on the FDIT?
Sir?
What was the high limit on the FDIT?
I remember 456.
456. That's not very high.
That's Kelvin.
Yeah.
Bill, were you shot at, you know, you had interceptors coming at you and missiles shooting at you. Were you actually shot at, or your teammates? And how many of you qualified to fly the SR-71? It was in 90 or 100?
Hired 3 two-man crews a year. So I think the grand total of the people that ever flew the airplane was about 250. But that included the senators and the generals that got their token rides.
They're 4 hours.
Answer your question, yes, I was shot at. We got North Korea launching SA-2 in '83. That's the last confirmed shot, by, at least with a missile. Lots of electronic indications, but that was the last confirmed launch. And which was the home base. Then Mildenhall, England, and Okinawa, Japan. I imagine there's some folks in here that have been to Okinawa. No doubt have seen it. From '66 all the way until 1990 when it was retired the first time, the operational missions continued, oftentimes for the Navy, out of all three locations, but primarily Okinawa or Kadena Air Base and Mildenhall, England. The typical mission began with a departure out of the operating location, and you took off with about half of a fuel load. Went straight to 25,000 feet, joined up with the tankers, and then topped off. And this was the slingshot that would then allow you to climb from 25,000 feet up to usually 75,000 and accelerating while we climbed, so that you launched off toward the sensitive area that we were tasked to go into with as much fuel as possible. The 80,000 pounds that the airplane carried lasted only about an hour and a half. That's about 13,300 gallons, as I remember, and you typically, when you came back down to hit a tanker again, you're down to about 10,000 pounds. So an hour and a half into a sensitive area, usually starting out at 75,000 and with a cruise climb, so that after you burn the weight down, it comes up into the mid-80s, and then back out 220 miles or so before the tanker, going on down again with the tanker, and do it all again. Sometimes 3, 4, 5 times. And that way you can cover a major part of a certain part of the world. It is not so much classified anymore. So for example, missions out of Mildenhall, England would go up west side of Norway up into the Barents Sea and watch the Soviet subpens pretty extensively, especially in the 80s when they had this little submarine called the Typhoon that could launch, sea-launched ballistic missiles right off the coast of the U.S. or out in the Atlantic and could target and reach the middle of the U.S. So the Navy and the Air Force combined would track every single one of those submarines. And back then, before the satellites had this sensor, the Soviets thought they were intelligent and pretty sneaky by taking these subs up underneath the ice cap in the north. The only sensor at that time that could detect them underneath the ice was something called ASARs, Advanced Synthetic Aperture Radar. Not a weather radar, but a mapping radar that could literally look through the ice and produce a picture. And the photo interpreters were then able to determine which submarine that was. Every day, or at least every other day, there was a mission to keep track of these subs, whether they were in their ports up there in the Barents Sea or out over the Atlantic. Pretty much of a cat and mouse game, but as a result of that, we got intercepted just about every flight, especially northeast of Norway. The intercepts were pretty exciting. You would get an indication on your radar device in the cockpit, but it would be way out in front of you. When you first got into the airplane, after flying, in my case, the F-4, interceptors didn't pop up way out in front of you. They popped up over to the side or a little behind you. Now, this would pop up in front. Well, they knew who we were. They knew they had to get a rolling start. And what they would attempt to do, and these were MiG 25s and 29s mostly, they would get an acceleration going and then try to pop up to usually about 70,000 feet, about the time we were catching up with them. With the contrails visible, they actually got to see the effect of 2,200 knots against their climbing typically 700 knot airspeed. And it was some, there was so much adrenaline pumping with that, but it gave you quite the sense of pride to feel the airplane and the speed that it had go blowing by them. 3 or 4 times, 3 or 4 different sensitive areas, then back to the tanker or back home. We would typically rotate airplanes between England and Japan, out of California or out of Palmdale. You take off out of California, and in 3 hours you would be coming across the Korean Peninsula into Okinawa, or if you're going the other way, you'd be coming across Scotland and back and down into Great Britain at about the same time. The body couldn't keep up with those time zone changes. You couldn't fly then for 3 days after that. We were not allowed to fly just because of the jet lag being so bad. But that's what a typical profile looked like. It was exciting. Because of the refueling, this is why you had to have as much experience as was required to get in the program. You just couldn't teach people to refuel. If they didn't have that experience already, they really weren't, you weren't going to get that training in the SR-71. With that, I'm gonna open up to questions. Bill?
You talk about the special fuels and lubricants and things.
Even submit your application for it, all volunteer program, until you had 1,500 hours of jet time. So you got a little bit more senior group compared to most military squadrons. If you were lucky after you submitted your application to be called in for an interview, you got to spend a week out in Northern California at Beale Air Force Base, meeting all the senior people involved in that organization. You got to fly the T-38 to prove that you could fly. You got to get in the simulator. And at the latter part of the week, you got to go back to the simulator, but this time in the full pressure suit. And let me tell you, it was at that point that probably 30% of the people that were selected for interviews, the interview ended. The pressure suit was somewhat claustrophobic. It was big, it was heavy. You had your own air conditioning, but you couldn't even move your head hardly from side to side without taking one hand up there, which was gloved, and moving it over to the side. You couldn't even see the circuit breaker panel, so a guy in the back seat had to say, if you want to pull this circuit breaker, 3rd row, 4 down. You would count it with braille. So it was a claustrophobia-inducing flying environment, and there were a certain number of those who said, nope, I don't think so. The rest of us that were able to get through that week without the claustrophobia getting too intense, were able to actually get pretty used to it. I'm in my Bonanza or my RV now. I can't help but stop and remember the difference in the comfort level, and that RV and that Bonanza are both mighty comfortable compared to that pressure suit. Let me show you this video here. It's about 10 minutes long. I think you'll enjoy it. Yes, sir.
In addition to the mission, just from flying that high and seeing that much of the world, did you just come away with any just observations or philosophy just about seeing so much of the world from that height?
I gave you a sense of how little we are and how big not only the world is, but how big the U.S. is. The sky becomes dark about 60,000 feet, but you begin to see the curvature very clearly. You realize how magnificent it is. So it gave you pause for reflection on that.
Thank you.
Tell you what I'm going to do now, I'll stay